Hey there. Tonight, we're not walking among kings or tracing the lines of battlefields. We're going somewhere quieter, somewhere slower. To a place most history books forget. You won't find this story carved into stone or hanging in a museum. But it's real. And it mattered. Tonight, we're stepping into the worn shoes of the medieval peasant. No titles. No armor. Just calloused hands, smoke-dimmed skies, and the stubborn rhythm of survival. If this kind of slow, grounded history helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same story. So dim the lights. Let the day fall away. And let's go, not to a castle or a battlefield, but to a crooked little village at the edge of a map no one ever finished drawing. Because sometimes the quietest lives leave the deepest echoes. Now close your eyes. And let the story begin. Not every story begins with a crown or a sword. Some begin where maps forget to stretch, where the land folds into itself like a tired body, and even the sun seems uncertain whether to linger. There is no name for this place, not one you'd find in ink. But for the dozen or so souls who call it home, it is everything. The village sits nestled in a shallow valley, its boundaries drawn not by law, but by memory, just past the old elm, or where the ground softens underfoot. No stones mark its edge. No banners flutter above its rooftops. If a cart passes through, it is talked about for weeks. If a traveler appears, children hide behind skirts and elders watch with wary eyes, as if the forest itself had spat someone out by mistake. You were born here, though even that is something you only know because someone told you so. You've never seen a birth certificate, never heard your age spoken with certainty. You measure life in seasons, in lean harvests and thick ones, in the way the air smells just before a storm rolls over the hills. Time does not move here in clean lines. It loops, soft and slow, a spiral of planting, growing, praying, surviving. The houses are crooked, slumped low as if bowing to an invisible burden. Walls made from wattle and daub, twigs woven like ribs, smeared with mud and manure, bend in quiet surrender to wind and rain. Thatched roofs sag beneath their own weight, patched each spring with hope and straw, and still leaking in the places you can't reach. Inside, the air carries the sour perfume of smoke, sweat, damp wool, and life packed too close together. There are no roads, only tracks. Mud ruts lined with puddles and sharp stones. Ox carts have carved their paths over generations, not so much paving the way as reminding you where not to walk barefoot. The idea of leaving? It's more myth than plan. The forest beyond the hill is dense, roots twist like questions you shouldn't ask, and branches close behind you if you dare step too deep. Rumors tell of a river to the north, but no one here has ever seen it. They speak of it like one might speak of dragons or saints, real, perhaps, but distant. Far too far. Towns are whispered about with equal disbelief. Places where buildings rise 3 stories high, where people wear shoes year-round and speak in accents like wind on glass. But you? You know only the weight of wet boots and the ache in your shoulders before noon. The village breathes in quiet rhythms. A low bell tolls from another village, faint on the breeze. If the wind doesn't bring it, you simply look at the sky. Shadows stretch across fields, and the angle of their bones tells you when to fetch the goats or stir the stew. Each day blurs into the next. Familiar. Predictable. A comfort so ingrained it becomes invisible. The people here are few and tightly woven. A dozen families, maybe less, each carrying names so old they've lost their meaning. You know everyone's cough. Everyone's laugh. Everyone's quiet tragedies that no one mentions unless the moment demands it. If someone vanishes, it's assumed they either went to the forest and got lost, or wanted to. Both are equally permanent. Tom is the elder, though that's a generous title. He once spoke to a monk, just once, and repeats that conversation like a relic. He claims to know Latin, though his Latin sounds suspiciously like sneezing. Still, his goat is healthy and his roof doesn't leak as much as the others. That's enough to make him wise. The forest looms like a forgotten god. It presses at the edges of fields and dreams. You don't go in, not really. You gather firewood from the edge, glance over your shoulder, and pretend not to notice the silence that settles there, deep, watchful, too old to care who you are. If something watches, it watches without blinking. You've heard of maps, but never seen one. Paper is too precious, and no one here knows how to read. Directions are given in stories: take the path past the leaning pine, then left at the stone shaped like a sleeping dog. But you've never followed them. Why would you? There's nothing out there for someone like you. Once, a stranger came. A woman wrapped in a blue cloak, hair like burnt honey, eyes sharp as flint. She asked for water. She left before dawn. For days, people whispered of omens and saints and royal spies. The spot where she stood remained untouched, as if her presence had imprinted on the dirt. You still glance at it when you pass. There's no school. No tavern. No inn. Just homes, one small chapel, and a communal well that groans like an old man every time the bucket lowers. Children learn to count by beans in a bowl, and letters are strange marks only the priest understands. Knowledge is not currency here, endurance is. And endure you do. Through winters that crack your knuckles open. Through summers that dry the well and steal sleep. Through springs so wet your boots never dry, and autumns that bring the soft dread of hunger. You share stew. You share silence. You share the knowledge that life is not a climb but a circle, and your footsteps wear grooves in it, deeper with each year. You've never seen the sea. Never ridden a horse. Never spoken to someone who wasn't born within a mile of your door. But you've felt the shift of seasons in your bones, read the sky like scripture, and known the joy of bread rising just right over a fire you tended since dawn. And that, somehow, is enough. For now. Morning doesn't arrive in this village with grandeur. It seeps in, slow and gray, through cracks in the thatch and shutters that never quite close. The light is not golden or heroic, it's a pale hush that spreads like fog over sleeping faces, warming nothing, promising little. But it's enough. It always has been. You wake to the sound of stirring bodies. The rustle of wool blankets. The muffled coughs of someone older. A goat snuffling near the hearth. A child sighing in their sleep. You stretch carefully, testing joints like old hinges, each one stiff with yesterday's labor. Beside you, someone rises to tend the coals, to coax heat from ash. No one speaks yet. speech is for when the fire catches. The room smells of smoke, sweat, old onions, and sour milk. You don't notice anymore. It's the scent of life lived close, too close, perhaps, but necessary. The air bites your nose. The rushes on the floor are damp again. The thatch overhead has begun its slow leak by the chimney stone. You note it, silently. One more thing for the long list of things that need doing and may never be done. The hearth glows with stubborn embers. You feed it slowly, twigs, then chips, then a thick branch kept dry beneath the bench. When the flame takes, so does the day. Now, voices emerge. Quiet ones. A mother hushing a child. A grumbled prayer. The sound of someone sipping water too cold for comfort. The village doesn't rise all at once. It unfolds like a hand, finger by finger, until all are moving. There is no rooster here. He died last year, and no one's replaced him. But the rhythm remains. Wake with the light. Eat what's left. Work till the shadow reaches the elm. Eat again, if there's anything. Sleep when the fire dies. Repeat. Each family follows this dance, not by choice, but by inheritance. You were born into it. You follow it without question. It's not a schedule, it's a truth. The stew from last night still simmers in the pot. It always simmers. You add water. Maybe a cabbage leaf. A pinch of something dry and green. You don't remember what it is anymore, only that it doesn't taste bad. The children eat first. Thin spoons. Quiet chewing. The youngest is learning not to ask for honey. That lesson is quicker than most. Outside, the village stretches its bones. Smoke rises from a dozen chimneys. A dog limps across the square. The elder's goat bleats once, as if counting the people still alive. You nod to a neighbor you haven't spoken to in 3 days. Not from anger. Just because words are for necessity. A broken fence. A shared task. A birth. A death. Silence is the normal state between such moments. You take your tools, battered, mended, older than your hands, and begin the day's work. Today, it's the field. Not planting, not yet. Still clearing. Still coaxing earth to be less stubborn. You swing the hoe with the practiced rhythm of someone who knows exactly how much strength they can spare before they ache tomorrow. You listen to the sound of metal hitting dirt, again and again, until it becomes a kind of prayer. The land is stingy. Shallow roots. Stones like buried teeth. The field has never been generous, only fair. Sometimes it surprises you, a sudden patch of soft soil, a cluster of beans that bloom without reason. On those days, you thank something quietly, not sure what it is. God, maybe. Or just the rain. You pause to drink from the clay jug, water gone slightly cloudy. You try not to think about what might be in it. The well was cleaned last spring, or at least talked about being cleaned. You've seen worse. The sun lifts slowly, unwilling. When it reaches the high sky, you know it's time to rest, briefly. Lunch is not a meal so much as a pause. A crust of bread. A slice of onion. Maybe a smear of lard if you're lucky. You chew slowly, not because it tastes good, but because there's nothing to follow. You sit in the shade of a leaning post, wiping sweat with the edge of your sleeve. The silence feels thicker at midday. Sometimes, someone hums. A tune too old to have a name. Not a song for joy, but for rhythm, for remembering. The kind of music that fills the space between heartbeat and breath. You don't join in. But you listen. Everyone listens. In the afternoon, you turn the compost. A mix of everything that once had value. Peels, bones, ash, failed attempts at cheese. You stir it with a stick that once belonged to your grandfather. He used it to herd geese. Now it moves rot. That's how things pass on. Not as heirlooms, but as solutions to problems no one bothered to fix before. By evening, the shadows stretch long again. The fire at home waits. The stew is thicker now, barely. You smell turnip and smoke and something that might have been meat 2 days ago. It's hot. That's what matters. Your family eats together, seated around the low table. No one speaks during the first few bites. It's a kind of reverence, not for the food, but for the silence around it. Later, there are murmurs. Someone scraped a knee. Someone found a bird's nest. Someone thought they saw a deer at the edge of the forest. It's the closest thing to news. Before sleep, you mend. A tear in a shirt. A crack in a bucket. You patch what you can. What you can't, you ignore. The candle sputters. Wax is precious. You let it die. As night settles in like a thick blanket, you stretch out beside the fire. Not in bed, there is no bed, but in space enough for rest. The dog curls near your feet. The child leans against your back. The wind taps the shutter like a finger reminding you that the world is still turning, whether you notice or not. You close your eyes. And the day folds in on itself like a letter no one will read. Rain comes before dawn, soft at first, then heavier, until the thatch above your head begins to leak in the usual corner, the one patched with old wool and stubborn hope. You reach for the rag without looking. It's already damp. So is your sleeve. So is the rush floor. So are your thoughts. You lie still for a moment, listening. The rain drips like slow footsteps on the roof. The fire is a low whisper now. A single ember pulses in the hearth. You nudge it back to life with a bit of bark and a prayer that's more habit than faith. The warmth returns grudgingly. The room is quiet except for the rain. The dog sighs. A child murmurs and turns in sleep. Someone coughs the kind of cough that says, "I'm still here, but also, not forever." You count the sounds like blessings. No silence means no death. Not yet. You rise slowly. Your back aches in the familiar way, like the land has left fingerprints across your spine. You stretch, reach for your boots, still wet, and pull them on anyway. There's no time to wait for dryness. The day doesn't ask if you're ready. It just begins. Outside, the world is gray and wet and exactly as expected. Mud wraps around your ankles before you've crossed the threshold. Chickens cluster beneath the lean-to, glaring at the sky like it owes them something. The goat bleats once, demanding food. You oblige. She's one of the few creatures in this village allowed to complain. You fetch water from the well. The bucket creaks. The rope burns your palms. You don't flinch. It's the same every day. You nod to the woodpile, rain-slick and shrinking. You'll need more soon, but not today. Today, there's that roof to fix, again. And the fence. And the path to clear. Breakfast is whatever's left in the pot, thinner now, with a hint of mold on the crust around the edges. You scrape it off. You don't mention it. No one does. The youngest eats first, again. You sip from the shared bowl. It's warm, and that's enough. Today is for wood gathering. Not the cutting kind, that's for people with forests and axes. You collect fallen branches, half-rotted logs, whatever the storm has seen fit to give back. You walk the edge of the tree line, never deeper. The woods are not forbidden, just impolite. People go missing in there, sometimes. They don't talk about it, but they remember. As you walk, the rain fades to mist. A thin, cold breath on the back of your neck. You gather quietly, fingers numb, eyes scanning for fungus, rot, signs of life. Not wildlife, those are rare, but other humans. Bandits. Outcasts. Men who have nothing and want less for you. You don't see any, but you keep your knife handy. A short blade. Dull. But comforting. By midday, your arms are full of damp branches. Not good for burning, but better than nothing. You stack them near the hut, under the slanted overhang. They'll need days to dry, maybe weeks. You hope the weather gives you that long. The sky disagrees, spitting cold drizzle in your face as you duck inside. The afternoon is spent mending the fence. Again. It leans more every season. The wood has given up on being wood. It's sponge now, dark and soft and crumbling beneath your touch. You lash the slats together with old rope, knotted until your fingers ache. The fence doesn't look better. But it stays up, and that's the victory. Someone calls your name. Not loudly, no one shouts here unless something's on fire or someone's dying. It's Tom, the village elder. He wants help with his roof. Again. You nod. He talks as you work, recounting the same story about the monk he met 20 years ago. You nod again. You've heard it 100 times, but it's one of the few tales this village has, and it grows longer with every telling. You fix his roof the best you can. The hole is smaller now. So is the sky through it. He offers you a turnip in thanks. You accept it like it's a coin. It feels like one. Heavy. Cold. Valuable. Evening arrives like a sigh. Long and quiet and almost gentle. The rain has stopped. The clouds have not. Smoke curls from the chimneys. One window glows with firelight. The village looks almost peaceful, if you squint, if you forget the rot and the cold and the slow ache in your shoulders. Dinner is stew. Of course. This time with a bit of barley and a memory of meat. You pretend not to notice the tiny bone at the bottom of the bowl. It was probably used 3 times already. Maybe more. It still gives flavor, or at least color. That's all you ask. After eating, there's silence. Not empty, just full of the kind of weariness that doesn't need words. You sit by the hearth, watching the flames, listening to the breathing of those around you. The child draws circles in the ash. Someone hums. It might be you. Later, in bed, or what passes for one, you lie still and listen. The house creaks. The dog twitches. A pot drips somewhere. The fire settles into a deep red pulse. You close your eyes and think of nothing. Not dreams. Not hopes. Just the warmth of your chest and the blanket's weight. Tomorrow will be the same. The roof will still leak. The stew will still simmer. The work will still wait. But you're still here. And in this village, that's enough. The wind changes in the night. You don't hear it, not at first, not over the snoring, the sighing of the half-dead fire, the rustle of sleeping limbs. But you feel it. A shift in the cold. A pressure behind the eyes. By morning, everything smells different: damp bark, crushed leaves, something distant but sharp, like burnt iron or crushed nettle. The forest is closer today. Not physically. The trees haven't moved. But something in their silence has grown louder, like they're leaning in just slightly, watching. You don't say this aloud. You just note it. Like you'd note a sore tooth or a limp in the goat. Nothing to panic about. Just something to keep in your mind, tucked behind more pressing things: splitting wood, digging out the latrine pit, checking the grain sacks for weevils. You slip outside and the air clings to your skin. The fog is thick enough to press against. Not a mist, but a weight, rolling in from the tree lean like someone poured milk into the valley. Shapes blur. Sound dies. Your own breath seems suspicious. You light the fire anyway. You feed the goat. She hesitates before eating. That's new. You pat her flank twice, not for comfort, yours or hers, but to feel something alive. Inside, the rest of the house begins to stir. A child coughs, then coughs again. Wet. Deep. You glance back. Her cheeks are flushed. Her lips are dry. There's no fever yet, but it's waiting. You tuck a blanket higher, pour her the last of the cool water, and smile like it's enough. You'll need time. Or garlic. Or something. But you used the last of it 2 days ago. You remind yourself of this calmly. Panic doesn't change the facts. You've lived long enough to know that. There's a man in the village who knows herbs. Jorgen. He doesn't speak much. No family. Just a small, crooked house near the edge of the field. People whisper he talks to the forest. That it listens. That he was born with a membrane over his face and never cried until he was 5. You don't believe that, but you also haven't gone looking. Today, you go looking. You don't tell anyone where you're going. You just put on your boots, grab your cloak, and nod at Tom as you pass. He nods back, expression unreadable. His goat watches you leave like she knows something you don't. The fog thickens toward the trees. Paths disappear. Footprints blur. You walk with one hand near your belt, not on a weapon, but on the small carving your mother gave you when you were 12. A saint. Maybe. The face is worn smooth. Jorgen's hut appears slowly, like something emerging from a half-forgotten dream. Smoke rises from the chimney in a lazy spiral. The door is half open, but you knock anyway. He doesn't answer. You step inside. It smells like ash and crushed flowers. Not pleasant. Not unpleasant. Just strange. Jorgen is sitting near the hearth, peeling something that might be bark, or might be bone. He doesn't look up. I need garlic, you say. He keeps peeling. For the child. The cough. He still doesn't speak. Then, slowly, he points to a bundle on the shelf. You take it. It's tied with red string. How much? He shrugs. You place the carving on the table. He doesn't touch it. You nod anyway, and leave. The fog is thicker on the way back, and the trees lean closer. By the time you return, the child is sleeping. Still flushed. Still breathing. You crush the garlic, mix it with weak ale, and press it between cloths warmed by the fire. You don't know if it will help. But you've done something. That has to count for something. Evening creeps in slow. The fog doesn't lift. The trees stay where they are. But the village feels tighter. Like the air's been wound around every roof and fence post. Everyone moves a little slower. No one laughs. You hear whispers from the chapel. Someone lights a candle and leaves it in the field. You don't ask why. The child stirs. Her eyes open for a moment. She sees you. Smiles. Then sleeps again. That night, no one sleeps well. The wind circles the cottage like a dog with no master. The fire doesn't catch properly. The pot won't boil. Somewhere in the dark, an owl calls once. Then nothing. Even the goat is silent. You lie in bed, eyes on the roof. Listening. Not for wolves. Not for bandits. For something older. Something the fog carried in. You think about Jorgen. About the trees. About the strange weight of the carving you left behind. And you wonder, not for the first time, what it is the forest remembers. Some years you're simply hungry. Other years, you're in a famine. There's a difference. Hunger is routine, a known discomfort, an empty ache managed with careful planning and quiet endurance. But famine is an unraveling. A break in the rhythm of survival. Famine means that even the tools of coping, stretching rations, boiling roots, bartering with neighbors, no longer work. It's when the cupboard turns into a memory, and hope itself becomes harder to justify. In the village, you feel it before anyone names it. It begins not in the dead of winter, but in the warmth of summer, when the earth should be generous and green. But the rains are wrong. Too much, or not enough. The barley shoots never rise. The beans brown at the stem. The cabbages split open too soon or too small. You know the signs. Everyone does. They're carved into the faces of the old ones, drawn tight across their memories. By August, silence falls heavier across the fields. By September, it settles into the bones. You grind the last of the flour with a heaviness in your chest. The stew thins. The bread shrinks. You begin to count, not in days, but in meals. How many are left? How many can be stretched? How much can be given to the child without shorting the elder? At first, You lie to yourself. Maybe another village fared better. Maybe the manor will open its doors. Maybe the Lord will grant mercy. But soon, even lies feel expensive. You kill the chickens first. Then the goat. The dog disappears one day, and no one asks where. The last apple falls from the tree and rolls into the mud, and two children reach for it with the same hand. That night, no one speaks at supper. There's nothing left to say. The belly is a strange thing during famine. It doesn't roar, it shrinks. It curls in on itself like a frightened animal. You stop waking from hunger. You start sleeping because it's easier than being conscious. Dreams become strange, full of meals you've never had, smells you've forgotten, hands placing bowls before you that disappear before you can taste. The children stop playing. Their cheeks hollow, their voices quiet. They stop asking when the bread will return. That's when you know the famine is real, not because the fields are bare, but because the laughter is gone. You try everything. You boil acorns and leach out the bitterness. You chew bark, hoping the stories about famine bread are true. You grind weeds and mash roots and invent recipes out of desperation. Anything not nailed down becomes a maybe. Sometimes you eat things you don't speak of. You start to keep secrets. A handful of lentils hidden in a sock. A crust of bread tucked under the straw mattress. You pretend not to notice when others do the same. Theft becomes quieter. More forgivable. Nobody condemns a hungry hand. The steward stops visiting. At first, it's a relief. Then it's a warning. If he isn't collecting, it means there's nothing worth collecting. The manor is starving, too. The church prays, distributes what it can, but its stores are shallow and the line is long. The fire becomes your companion. Not for cooking, but for remembering warmth. You sit by it not to eat, but to survive another cold evening. When the coals dim, your hope flickers with them. Neighbors die. Quietly. Without ceremony. A thin blanket draped over a still form. A candle lit and left to burn until it gutters out. Graves are dug shallower now. There's no strength for deeper ones. Then, finally, a shift. The rains return. The soil gives a little. The shoots poke through, tentative, trembling, but alive. You plant what little seed you saved. You beg the earth to be kinder. And it is. Slowly. The first harvest is meager, but it is something. A turnip. A full loaf. A pot of stew that smells like food again. You serve the children first. You always do. You watch them eat, and for the first time in months, you taste through their joy. You survived. Not by strength alone, but by persistence. By sacrifice. By hope made stubborn. And when you chew that first mouthful of real bread, cracked on top, warm inside, you close your eyes, and for a moment, it tastes like victory. By the time you can walk, the church already owns a piece of you. Your name was whispered over a basin of cold water, your forehead marked by a hand that trembled from age or faith or both. You didn't choose to belong. You were claimed. Folded into a system so large and old that even the priests no longer questioned it, only tended to it like a fire that had always burned. The church wasn't just the building with the crooked bell tower. It was the calendar, the law, the silence before a storm. It was the shape of your year and the whisper behind your deathbed. There were no options. The church was simply the air around you, thick, sacred, and filled with rules you didn't always understand but always followed. You didn't speak Latin. You didn't know what the priest said during Mass, but you stood anyway. You knelt. You bowed your head. You crossed yourself when the others did. You learned the rhythm of ritual like you learned how to tell if rain was coming. Not with comprehension, but with familiarity. It was muscle memory of the soul. The priest was the only one who could read, and so he read for all of you. He read prayers, taxes, royal decrees, and lists of names for the dead. He read stories of saints who bled for their faith, of martyrs who smiled while burning. You listened. You believed, at least enough to light a candle. The church owned 1/10 of everything you produced. A tithe. Whether the harvest was good or bad didn't matter. 1 sack out of 10 belonged to God, and God had a barn much bigger than yours. You didn't question the system because questioning the church was like questioning the sun. It might be unfair, but it still rose. And besides, the church gave you more than it took. It gave you a map for a world too cruel to navigate alone. When a child sickened, the priest had a saint to pray to. When your field flooded, he had a reason for it. When your cousin died after a dream of black wings, he explained it was divine punishment, merciful, even. Without that structure, the chaos would have drowned you. There were saints for everything. Saint Apollonia for toothaches. Saint Isidore for plowing. Saint Sebastian for plague. Their names weren't just uttered, they were tools. You called on them when the well went dry or the pig got sick. You whispered their names into your stew. You tied them into ribbons and nailed them above the door. Pilgrimage was one of the only reasons to leave the village. To walk somewhere sacred. To sleep on the roadside. To kneel before a shrine that had once been visited by someone who had once seen a miracle. It wasn't just a journey. It was a kind of gamble. You offered your feet, your hunger, your pain, in exchange for grace. And when you came back, blistered and thinner, people treated you differently. You were no richer, no cleaner, but you had touched something. And maybe something had touched you back. The church taught that your suffering had meaning. That your low station wasn't failure, it was the will of God. That your obedience would be rewarded after death. That your sins could be washed clean, but only if you paid. Sometimes with coin. Sometimes with fasting. Sometimes by buying an indulgence, a piece of parchment with a signature and a promise. The poor gave eggs. The rich gave land. The church grew fat on both. Still, you believed. Not always joyfully. Not always without question. But belief wasn't a bright flame. It was a low, smoldering ember, kept alive by repetition and fear. You didn't expect miracles. You just hoped the roof wouldn't leak too much and that the priest remembered your name when it was your turn to be buried. Death was not the end. At least, not entirely. It was a hallway. Narrow, dark, and lined with prayers. You feared hell, of course. But purgatory was more terrifying in some ways, a slow burning weight with no clock on the wall. Your family would pray for you, light candles, pay coins, whisper your name so that eventually, maybe, you'd be remembered enough to leave. The church promised heaven, but it rarely painted it clearly. What it did paint, often and with vigor, was the cost of not getting there. So you bowed. You confessed. You nodded along. You gave. You feared. You waited. And in that waiting, you lived a life shaped not by choice, but by ritual. By bells that told you when to wake, fast, feast, kneel, and die. And that rhythm, however flawed, was the closest thing to peace you were ever promised. You might think that after everything they endured, after the taxes and plagues, the hunger and backbreaking labor, peasants would have revolted more often. That the weight of centuries spent kneeling would have eventually snapped. That one year, when the frost came too early and the steward took too much and the priest's blessing rang hollow, someone would finally shout, "No more." And others would echo it. And the whole village would rise. But they didn't. Not often. Not all at once. There were uprisings. Scattered sparks in a dark countryside. The Jacquerie in France. The peasants' revolt in England. Isolated riots in German towns and Italian valleys. Moments when someone pushed too hard, or asked too much, or punished too cruelly. The peasants would gather, tools in hand, hearts pounding, and for a few days, they would burn the manor, chase off the bailiff, tear down the tithe barns, and shout things they'd never dared whisper before. And then the soldiers came. The sword was swift. The punishments swiftest. Bodies hung from trees. Villages fined, stripped, reduced. Those who'd watched from the hedges said little. Those who'd shouted loudest disappeared. Rebellion wasn't impossible. It was just expensive. And peasants couldn't afford it. To understand why they didn't rise, you have to stop imagining them as broken or docile. They weren't. They were practical. Their lives were calibrated to survival, not revolution. They didn't lack fire. They lacked margin. Every day was already spent balancing on the edge. One bad harvest, one extra tax, one sick child was enough to tip the scale. Uprising wasn't just dangerous. It was reckless. You could protest, or you could plant. You couldn't do both. The system wasn't stable because it was fair. It was stable because it was ancient. Because it had sunk into everything, into language, into ritual, into the way you measured your worth. You didn't see it as a system. You saw it as reality. The seasons turned. The Lord collected. The church absolved. And the wheel kept spinning. Even when you hated it, you relied on it. Rebellion, real rebellion, wasn't just about anger. It required coordination, communication, strategy. And peasants were kept from those things. You couldn't read. You didn't have maps. You didn't know who ruled 3 villages over, let alone what his policies were. Your world ended at the tree line. And beyond that? Rumor and fear. The church taught obedience as virtue. To kneel was to be humble. To suffer was to be purified. The meek would inherit the earth, eventually. And if not this earth, then the next. Heaven was the reward, and questioning the hierarchy risked not just your life, but your soul. So you nodded when the priest spoke. You bowed when the Lord passed. Not always out of belief. Sometimes out of exhaustion. The rare times resistance did rise, it wasn't in speeches or slogans. It was in silence. In shared glances when the steward miscounted. In bread baked in hidden ovens. In a pig not listed on the tally. In stories told around the fire of long-ago heroes and clever tricksters who outwitted the taxman. Those were the rebellions most could afford. You bartered. You bent. You buried grain. You helped a neighbor fix his fence when the reeve wasn't looking. You lived in the margins. That was your resistance. And yet, people did dream. Of course they did. They dreamed of a day when the Lord's sun would turn kind. When the tithe would shrink. When the church would see them not as debtors, but as souls. Some dreamed of fleeing. Of finding a town, a new name, a better life. But those dreams, too, cost more than most could pay. The manor loomed. The priest watched. The ledger waited. So instead of tearing down the system, you chipped away at it. Quietly. Patiently. You told your daughter to marry the carpenter's boy, not the reeve's nephew. You taught your son how to patch a roof and how to avoid the bailiff's eyes. You passed down the names of herbs that healed and the signs that warned. You didn't build a revolution. You built endurance. Because sometimes resistance doesn't look like fire. Sometimes it looks like lighting a candle and hiding it from the wind. And somehow, against all odds, you survived. Long before the Black Death swept across Europe, peasants already knew the quiet terror of illness. Not the kind that came and went with the seasons, but the kind that crept in quietly, one cough, one fever, one swollen limb at a time, and didn't leave. You didn't need a plague to fear sickness. You only needed a single infected scratch, a fever that didn't break, or a cough that settled too deep in the chest. There were no hospitals. No trained doctors. The closest thing to medicine was a wise woman with herbs and superstitions or a monk with dusty scrolls and trembling hands. Most cures were based on what had worked before, or what hadn't killed someone last time. You believed illness came from bad air, or sin, or a sour mood from a neighbor. Miasma, some called it, the stench of decay that brought disease on the breeze. Others blamed unclean thoughts, the evil eye, or spirits lurking in the shadow of a doorframe. If someone got sick, the whole village took note. They whispered, prayed, burned rosemary, tied garlic over doorways, or scattered salt at thresholds. If it was you who got sick, you lay still and waited. There was no medicine. Only herbs boiled in water, a poultice of mashed onions and bread, or a whispered prayer over your brow. Fever might lift, or deepen. You didn't know. You couldn't know. One night you might sleep through the worst of it. Another, you might wake with blackened fingers and know, without doubt, that something inside you had already begun to rot. The body was mysterious. So was death. The church said illness could be a test. A punishment. A way to purify your soul. So you confessed. You fasted. You promised to do better. You didn't fight the sickness, not really. You endured it. And then came the plague. No one knew what to call it at first. Just that people in another village had started dying. Then it was 2 villages. Then 5. Then carts full of bodies. The priests stopped visiting homes. Bells tolled without pause. Doors were marked with crosses. Entire families vanished in a week. The plague moved like a shadow, quiet, quick, and impossible to predict. It swelled necks and groins with painful lumps. It blackened fingers. It stole the breath. People bled from their noses. Hallucinated. Collapsed in the mud. Some died in hours. Others lingered for days, shivering, muttering, clutching at the sky. You didn't know how it spread. You only knew it did. So you stopped touching. You burned old clothes. You boiled everything. You stopped going to mass. You stopped talking to neighbors. You stayed inside and waited. The smell of burning straw and meat hung in the air for weeks. Priests died. Stewards died. Whole villages emptied. Fields went unharvested. Roads were silent. Some believed it was the end of the world. Others said it was punishment for sin. Some thought it was the stars. A rare alignment. A curse from the east. The reasons didn't matter anymore. You only cared whether it would come to your village next, and if it already had. The lucky ones got mild fevers and lived. The unlucky ones coughed once and didn't rise again. Graves were dug fast, if at all. Sometimes people were buried in their own yards. Sometimes, not at all. The ground was frozen. The hands to dig were gone. You lit candles. You sang psalms. You said names out loud, even when no one answered back. And yet, life didn't stop. Not completely. The fire still needed tending. The goats still needed feeding. Children still cried from hunger and fear. If you survived, you didn't celebrate. You whispered thanks. You looked at the empty beds and the tools that no one would use again. You stared at the sky a little longer. You smelled everything before you ate it. You kept to yourself more. You didn't forget the plague. No one did. It rewrote your life in silence. The friend who was always late to mass, gone. The elder who used to tell stories, buried. The field once plowed by 3 families, now tilled by one boy with a crooked back. But you survived. And in time, the fever broke. The bells stopped ringing. The grass grew over the graves. You learned again how to laugh, how to mend, how to plant without fearing that your hands were the next to go cold. The sickness never truly left. But neither did you. Night in the medieval countryside didn't arrive gently. It swallowed the village whole. Once the sun dipped beyond the trees and the last streaks of gold vanished from the sky, the world closed in. There were no street lamps. No warm window glows. Just a darkness thick enough to feel with your hands. And in that darkness, the village shrank. The roads vanished. The forest pressed in closer. And you, no matter how brave, felt suddenly very small. You didn't stay awake long after dark. Not because you were disciplined, but because there was no reason to. Candles were rare. Tallow lamps flickered fitfully and smoked up the rafters. Firewood was precious. Every hour of light stolen from the fire was an hour stolen from tomorrow's warmth. So, you slept. But sleep didn't come all at once, or all night long. It came in pieces, first sleep, a waking period, then second sleep. You didn't think of it as odd. It was just the rhythm of life. After supper and a few muttered prayers, the family bedded down together in a pile of limbs and breath and wool. Straw-filled mattresses, if you had them. Woven rushes, if you didn't. Everyone shared one room. Children, parents, grandparents. Sometimes even the dog. On especially cold nights, the cow might be brought inside. A few chickens, too. Warmth mattered more than privacy. You curled close, faces turned to the dying hearth. The glow of the embers cast long, soft shadows across the cracked walls, dancing as if they had secrets to tell. Somewhere in the corner, a mouse stirred in the straw. A child sighed. The roof creaked under the weight of snow. Then, in the middle of the night, you woke. Not because you had to, but because that's just how nights worked. You'd sit up. Stir the fire. Step outside to relieve yourself. Sometimes pray. Sometimes just sit and think. These waking hours were quiet, private. A strange middle space between yesterday and tomorrow. People whispered to one another. Shared dreams. Made love. Asked questions too dangerous for daylight. Dreams, especially, mattered. If you dreamt during this waking hour, it was thought to be truer. Closer to the spirit world. You'd remember those dreams. You might tell them to the wise woman or the priest. They were signs. Warnings. Blessings. You'd wake someone to tell them. Or whisper it into the straw so you wouldn't forget. Eventually, the second sleep came. Deeper, slower. It wasn't restful, not always. The cold bit through the wool. The fire dimmed to a whisper. Sometimes someone coughed through the night. That hard, wet cough that made you listen more closely. You knew the difference between a cold and something worse. The dark wasn't just emptiness. It was crowded, with fears. Wolves. You'd heard them. Not far off, but too close. Their howls weren't stories, they were warnings. The edge of the village wasn't a barrier. It was a suggestion. Wolves didn't knock. Then there were thieves. Strangers. Men who came through the woods with no intention of preying. The door had a latch, but a strong kick could snap it. You kept the axe near the bed, just in case. Not that you'd be quick enough. And then, there were the things you couldn't name. The spirits. The old gods, maybe. The witches, if you believed in such things. You didn't talk about them openly. But you left offerings in the hedgerow. You tied herbs above the door. You whispered charms over your children's beds. Just in case. You hung iron by the threshold. Drew crosses in ash on the beam. Faced the bed toward the hearth. Not for comfort, but for protection. The dark was not your friend. It was tolerated, survived, respected. Some said your soul wandered while you slept. That you had to be careful not to wake too suddenly. Or it might not return. You didn't laugh at this. Too many stories proved otherwise. But for all the fear, there was also peace. You could hear your family breathing. The quiet shifting of a sleeping goat. The sigh of wind slipping through the thatch. You were surrounded by life. Warmth. Familiar sounds. You knew every creak of the floor. Every bend in the wall. Every face by firelight. You had survived another day. And with luck, you'd survive the night. By morning, you'd stir again. Slowly. Carefully. Not every body would rise. But most would. You'd count them silently in your head, just to be sure. And when the coals sparked to life and the bread was broken, the new day began. And for one more day, the night had passed you by. Some years, you were just hungry. Other years, you were starving. But famine was different. Hunger, at least, played by rules. You could stretch food. Share it. Hope the weather turned, or that a merchant passed through with salted fish. Hunger was something you could live with. You'd done it before. You'd do it again. But famine rewrote everything. It didn't creep. It arrived with the silence of fields that refused to green. With the limp knot of barley that should have stood tall. With the rust-colored spots on beans that never sprouted. The signs were there, early and unmistakable. A winter that clung too long. A spring that rotted the roots instead of waking them. You saw it in the elder's face when he looked at the sky and said nothing. And when the bread started to shrink, you knew. At first, the changes were quiet. The stew thinned. You used more water, fewer vegetables. The bread became denser, flatter, more like stone than loaf. The herbs disappeared from the pot. So did the salt. So did the smiles. Children noticed before they understood. They asked for seconds that didn't exist. They scraped the bowls with their fingers. The dog, once lazy and fat, watched you now, silent and tense. The chickens stopped laying. The goat gave sour milk. The pot held less than the day before. You tried to pretend. You added bark to the flour. Ground acorns. Boiled grass. Called it stew even when it tasted like mud. You joked about the flavor. Laughed at how long the bread lasted. But the jokes got thinner too. Neighbors stopped visiting. Not out of rudeness, but because sharing meant someone else went without. The village grew quiet. Fires were tended, but not talked around. No songs. No gossip. Just the dry sound of spoons on clay and the wind scratching against the shutters. You rationed everything. The last few onions. A lump of cheese wrapped in old cloth. Even dreams. You saved them for the children. The Lord Steward came by once. Took stock. Wrote notes. Promised relief that never came. Maybe he meant it. Maybe he didn't. It didn't matter. His horse left deeper prints in the mud than anything else that spring. By midsummer, the animals were gone. Sold, slaughtered, or simply dead. A family down the lane buried 3 goats in one morning. You didn't ask how. You didn't offer condolences. You just nodded when you passed their door. Everyone nodded. That was enough. You chewed slower. Not to savor, there was nothing to savor, but to make it last. You stopped dreaming of meat. You started dreaming of bread. Then came the whispers. Someone caught a rabbit. Someone else found a fish. Someone's uncle boiled a shoe. Someone's cousin, you didn't repeat that part. The villagers turned inward. Eyes grew sunken. Words came less often. No one asked questions. You didn't want the answers. The graveyard filled without ceremony. Shallow graves dug with shaking hands. No priest. Just a few muttered words and a handful of dirt. Sometimes the name was known. Sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes you thought you'd forgotten it even as you buried the face. And then, as suddenly as it began, the ground softened. The rains came. The sprouts pushed through the soil. Thin, yellow, late, but alive. You cried the first time you saw green. You bent down and touched the stalk like it was a miracle. Maybe it was. The first harvest wasn't much. But it was food. You didn't eat the first loaf. You stared at it. Passed it around. Let everyone touch it. Then you broke it with trembling hands and fed the youngest first. The old man next. You took what was left. You always took what was left. You remembered everyone who hadn't made it. You counted them with your eyes closed. You spoke their names when no one was listening. And when you bit into that bread, you didn't taste wheat. You tasted survival. That year, no one complained about the weather. No one cursed the rain. You thanked the sun. Thanked the soil. Thanked even the weeds for daring to grow. Because for once, the world had given back. And you, somehow, were still here. By the time you could walk, the church already had your name. A priest whispered Latin over your head, made a mark with water, and folded your soul into something too large to see and too deep to leave. You didn't choose the church. It chose you. Not out of cruelty or kindness, but because it was always there, like weather, like gravity, like the seasons. You didn't visit the church. You lived inside its shadow. It was not just a building. Not just sermons or saints. It was the shape of the year, the rules of the kitchen, the silence in your prayers, and the fear you swallowed when your child coughed at night. The church named the days. It told you when to fast, when to feast, when to kneel. You didn't say April, you said after Easter. You didn't say Tuesday, you said after Saint Agatha. It decided when meat could be eaten, and what kind. It told you when to abstain, when to confess, and what counted as sin. Lust was sin. Laziness was sin. Worry was sin. Doubt, definitely sin. But it also offered you something else. Not just guilt, but answers. The kind that filled the spaces fear had carved. You didn't understand the Latin. No one did. The priest stood before the altar, his voice droning like bees in a bottle, chanting words older than memory. But that didn't matter. The sound itself was holy. You bowed when the others did. You crossed yourself when the bells rang. You didn't need understanding. You needed structure. You needed rhythm. You needed something to keep the edges of the world from curling up and breaking apart. And the church did that. There was a saint for everything. For eyes, for teeth, for plowing, for rain. For women in childbirth. For animals. For the plague. You knew their names better than your neighbors. You carved their symbols into the barn door. You whispered to them when storms gathered or children burned with fever. Sometimes they answered. Sometimes they didn't. But you asked anyway. Pilgrimage was a way to leave, but not to escape. You walked dusty roads, past strangers who looked just like you, clutching beads, herbs, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. You slept in ditches, under barns, beside hedges, with your feet swollen and your prayers louder than your breath. You didn't expect miracles. But you hoped for something quieter, a shift, a softening of sorrow. A reason to return. You gave 1/10 of everything you had. Even if it wasn't enough. Even if it hurt. Even if your children went without. The church called it the tithe. God's share. But God didn't come for it. The priest did. Or his steward. They took barley, eggs, cider, wool. And you gave it because to say no meant not just sin, but punishment. In this life. And maybe the next. Still, the church wasn't only taking. It gave you a map. A way to hold your sorrow. When the cow died, when the well ran dry, when your sister didn't wake, it gave you words. They didn't always help. But they gave you something to say into the silence. When death came, the priest came too. With oil, and prayers, and the promise that this wasn't the end. That something waited. That this life wasn't all there was. That heaven was real, and you were going there, if you'd been good. If you'd given. If you'd obeyed. If someone remembered to light candles in your name. Because even after death, the church wasn't done with you. There was purgatory. A place between. Not hell, not heaven. Just waiting. And waiting cost coin. Or prayers. Or both. Your family would pay it. Light candles. Say your name. Pay the priest to say Mass. Not because they were sure it worked. But because not doing it felt worse. The church held your soul like a book it refused to let you read. It told you what the pages meant. You didn't ask to see them. You believed, because not believing was a door you couldn't afford to open. Doubt was dangerous. Doubt invited questions. Questions invited silence. And in a world held together by rituals and repetition, silence was the loudest threat of all. So you stayed. You knelt. You bowed. You learned to cross yourself without thinking. You said the words you understood, and the ones you didn't. You handed over your grain and hoped your soul was enough. Because when the wind howled through the cracks in the wall, when your child coughed through the night, when the stars shifted and the fields wouldn't yield, you needed to believe that someone was listening. Even if they never answered. You might think that after everything they endured, famine, plague, the boot of lords, and the burdens of tithes, peasants would have risen more often. That hardship would ferment into rage. That the weight of centuries might, one day, crack. And sometimes, it did. But rarely. And never for long. The great revolts of medieval Europe, like the peasants' revolt of 1381 in England, or the Jacquerie in France, were sparks, not wildfires. Short-lived, chaotic, and often crushed before they truly began. One tax too many. One steward too cruel. One winter too cold. That was all it took to break the silence. And just as quickly, the silence returned. Why not more? Why not louder? Because rebellion came at a cost the poor couldn't afford. In a world where every day was spent keeping your child fed, your roof patched, your goat alive, there was no room for revolution. No time for manifestos. You dug, you carried, you bled. Not because you were docile, but because you were tired. The manor had swords. The church had curses. The law had gallows. You had a rake, a prayer, and a mouth full of broken teeth. You couldn't fight with that. You survived with it. The system worked, not because it was fair, but because it was old. Deep. Rooted like oak. Your grandfather knelt under it. Your father did too. So you did the same. Not out of reverence, but because the world was built that way. Changing it felt as likely as tilting the moon. But you weren't blind. You saw the lords drink the wine pressed from your grapes. You watched priests in silk robes demand eggs from starving mothers. You heard rumors, always rumors, of cities where merchants rose above their birth. Where guilds had voices. Where coins bought more than bread. But rumors don't feed chickens. You didn't revolt because you had a family to feed. Because your neighbor's fence needed mending. Because you remembered the last man who tried. And what the steward did to him. You weren't passive. You were practical. Resistance took smaller shapes. A pig kept off the books. A few extra apples hidden in a sack. A tithe measured just short of what was due. A prayer said silently with no intention behind it. A song sung after dark, mocking the steward's limp or the Lord's nose. These were your rebellions, quiet, careful, survivable. The stories mattered, too. You told tales of cunning peasants who tricked greedy reeves. Of saints who rose from the fields. Of angels that visited kitchens, not castles. Stories that made you laugh, sometimes cry, always endure. They weren't about overthrowing the world, they were about enduring it. Because endurance was the revolution that didn't get punished. The church helped keep things still. It preached that suffering had purpose. That meekness would be rewarded. Not here. But later. In heaven, if not in harvest. It warned of hell with all the colors of fire. It promised grace, but only through obedience. The message was clear: bend, and be blessed. Resist, and burn. And maybe you believed that. Or maybe you didn't. But you acted like you did. And that was enough. Besides, even if you wanted to rebel, who would follow you? The village was not full of strangers. It was family, cousins, friends, the man who helped rebuild your roof, the woman who gave you herbs when your daughter was sick. To tear it apart would be to tear yourself apart. You didn't want fire. You wanted tomorrow. You wanted a roof that held. Bread that rose. A field that yielded. A moment at the fire when no one cried from hunger. Those things mattered more than banners or slogans or blood. But you dreamed. Of course, you dreamed. Of walking past the edge of the woods and finding a place where no one asked for your grain. Of a life where your son didn't break by 30. Where your daughter could read. Where you weren't born owing. These dreams didn't stir rebellion. They stirred resilience. You adapted. You taught your children when to nod and when to hide. How to bribe a bailiff with eggs instead of coin. How to barter with silence. How to tell stories that carried truth without being dangerous. You became fluent in the unspoken. You lived in the spaces between laws. And sometimes, just sometimes, things shifted. A new lord came and was gentler. A priest forgave more than he condemned. A good harvest softened the tax. A steward's ledger caught fire. You took what you could from those moments. Not justice, but breathing room. That was enough. You weren't trying to destroy the world. You were trying to survive it. And that, in its quiet way, was stronger than any uprising. Because when the castles fell, and the names of kings were forgotten, the field still remembered your hands. The soil still bore your weight. The song still carried your voice. You outlasted them. And maybe that, in the end, was the greatest rebellion of all. There's a strange silence that comes with grief, especially when it happens in waves. Long before the Black Death ever reached your village, you already knew sickness. You'd watched it settle into homes like smoke, invisible but thick, clinging to skin, slowing breath, darkening days. Illness wasn't something that struck like lightning, it seeped. Slowly. Quietly. Always lurking. You didn't have a word for infection. You didn't know what a germ was. But you knew what it looked like when someone didn't come back from the well because their legs had given out. You knew how the skin turned sallow. How the cough grew deeper. How the eyes went glassy long before the breath stopped. You prayed. You whispered. You boiled herbs. You begged saints whose names you couldn't spell. The wise woman mixed poultices, pale green or bitter black, depending on the ailment. Some worked. Most didn't. You lit candles anyway. Sickness was constant. It was in the water you drank, the food you couldn't quite keep down, the cut that wouldn't close. It followed the seasons, sometimes disguising itself as cold, sometimes as rot. You heard your neighbor's baby cry less. Then not at all. Sometimes, you'd wake in the middle of the night and listen. Not for danger, but for breathing. The silence was worse. The village had its rituals. When someone fell ill, they were wrapped tighter, placed closer to the fire. You laid herbs beneath the mattress. Rubbed vinegar on their chest. Whispered protection into the straw. And if they didn't recover, if the fever broke not into sweat, but into stillness, then the bells rang. If someone could lift the rope. When death came, it wasn't always announced. Sometimes you just noticed someone hadn't been seen for a while. That no smoke curled from their chimney. That their dog sat alone at the door. That the chickens were too quiet. You didn't ask right away. It wasn't your place. When you did find out, you responded with the same nod everyone did. That mix of sorrow, exhaustion, and the strange relief that it hadn't been your family. Not this time. Then came the digging. Graves were shallow. Not for lack of respect, but lack of strength. You wrapped the body, crossed yourself, spoke the words you could remember. The priest would come if he could. If he was well. If he wasn't attending 3 other burials that day. You placed the body in the earth. Not with ceremony. But with care. Then you went home. Boiled more water. Ate what you could. Slept, if you could. When the plague finally arrived, years later, it didn't come like a rumor. It came like a hammer. Sudden. Brutal. Unrelenting. You heard the stories first. Towns emptied. Priests collapsing mid-sermon. Whole families gone in a week. You didn't believe it. Not really. Stories always exaggerated. Right? Then a traveler passed through. Pale. Sweating. Rambling. He collapsed before reaching the square. The steward had his body burned. Just in case. But it was already too late. It started with a fever. A swelling in the neck or groin. Black patches on the skin. A deep ache in the bones. Then the coughing. The blood. The confusion. The prayers that no longer made sense. No one knew what caused it. Bad air. A curse. The alignment of stars. The wrath of God. You stuffed herbs in your clothes. Tied garlic above your door. Boiled your feet. Said every prayer you knew. It didn't matter. The village changed overnight. People stopped gathering. Doors stayed shut. Meals were shared less. Faces were pale. Eyes rimmed red. You marked the healthy not by their smile, but by their silence. Children stopped playing. Laughter vanished. Time itself felt sick. The church rang its bell so often that the rope snapped. The priest whispered final rites through a cloth. Then he stopped coming altogether. No one blamed him. He was coughing too. You burned things. Blankets. Straw. Clothes. You closed shutters not against the cold, but against the sight of another cart passing. Against the sound of crying from the house next door. The graveyard filled. Then overflowed. Then no one dug graves. You stopped counting the dead. You focused on the living. You nursed your cousin's child. You boiled soup from old bones. You whispered comfort into a house where no one else was breathing. You pressed a damp cloth to a forehead and pretended you didn't feel the fever rising in your own. And when the sickness passed, because eventually it did, it left behind something worse than fear. It left absence. Empty chairs. Unlatched doors. Tools untouched. Shoes that no one would wear again. You'd see something out of the corner of your eye and turn to speak, only to remember. You were quiet for weeks. Everyone was. The wind sounded louder. The fire too. There were no words. But slowly, inevitably, life returned. The bread was baked. The goats were milked. The fields were weeded. Because there was no other choice. The village rebuilt not with hammers, but with routine. With stubbornness. With grief that had no name but lived in your bones. The survivors didn't speak of what happened. Not directly. They folded it into stories, into prayers, into the careful way they checked on each other before sleep. And they kept going. Because that's what people did. Not because they were brave. But because they were alive. They say revolution leaves footprints, flags raised, walls torn down, names etched into stone. But here, in the quiet folds of forgotten villages, revolution didn't look like fire or steel. It looked like survival. You might think peasants never fought back. That after centuries of hunger, plague, tax, and silence, they would rise, burn the manor, drag the steward from his cart, shout their names loud enough to shake the crown from a king. But they didn't. Not often. And not because they were afraid. Because they were tired. And because revolt was a luxury only the full-bellied could afford. You see, rebellion didn't live in the fields. It lived in stories. In glances exchanged at the well. In the way someone didn't bow quite as deeply as they should have. In the loaf of bread baked in a forbidden oven. In a fence moved just slightly inward. They resisted in whispers. Not because they lacked courage, but because they understood cost. When you spent every ounce of energy just keeping your child fed, when your roof sagged and your back ached and your name was written in someone else's ledger, you didn't light torches. You lit fires. Small ones. To cook with. To stay warm. To keep going. And yet, revolts did happen. Now and then. The ones that made it into records, the Peasants' Revolt in England, the Jacquerie in France, brief flames that flickered high, then vanished under boots and swords. They weren't failures. They were warnings. The system didn't hold because it was loved. It held because it was heavy. Deep-rooted. Passed down like a birthright no one asked for. You were born owing. To the land, to the Lord, to the church, to time itself. So peasants did what they'd always done. They worked. But not without thought. Not without dreams. You dreamed of rest. Not luxury, just ease. Of a year with no bad harvests. Of a priest who looked you in the eye. Of your daughter marrying without needing to beg the steward's permission. You dreamed not of castles, but of dry roofs and full pots. Sometimes, that dream alone was enough to get you through another season. The Lord changed. His Son took over. The taxes rose, then fell, then rose again. You endured. The steward aged. The reeve's son was more cruel, or less. The tithes continued. You endured. Even the church, for all its weight, could not crush you completely. You still lit candles. Still sang at feast days. Still carved crosses into wooden beams. But sometimes, quietly, you skipped a prayer. Sometimes you gave the saints a knowing glance and kept your bread. Sometimes you made deals with your neighbors, unspoken, unsanctioned. A pig off the record. A sheaf of barley hidden in the thatch. Your village learned to bend without breaking. Because open rebellion got you killed. But quiet disobedience? That kept your children warm. And maybe, just maybe, that was its own kind of revolution. The land remembered your hands, even if the manor never did. The fields turned beneath your feet, not for love, but because you coaxed them to life. Year after year. With patience. With calluses. with a kind of stubborn grace the world never sang songs about. But it should have. Your strength wasn't loud. It was layered. Like the thatch over your head. Like the stew that boiled for days. Like the faith that never quite left you, even when the prayers went unanswered. You were not a footnote. You were the parchment. Without you, there were no kings, no wars, no kingdoms to conquer. Your silence built their world. And it also outlasted it. Because you passed your stories on, not in books, but in breath. At the hearth. In the furrows of a plow. In the way you folded dough with your grandmother's hands. In the lullabies you sang beside the fire. In the rituals you kept long after forgetting their names. When lords fell, when priests vanished, when wars came and went, the peasants remained. You remained. And that? That is legacy. Not carved in marble, but in mud and sweat and laughter and smoke. You endured. Not because you had to. But because you chose to.